My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 35 years old and a self-made billionaire in the world of business. 6 months ago, my husband vanished without a trace in the dead of night. The only thing he left behind was a set of divorce papers on the kitchen table. My father wasted no time telling me to forget about him. He dismissed Julian as a worthless man who had never deserved to carry our family name. But I refused to put my signature on those documents. The man I had built my life with wouldn't simply walk away without a reason. I was certain of that. Then, half a year later, everything changed in the most unexpected way. During a routine visit to one of my construction sites, I spotted him, my missing husband, hauling bags of cement like any ordinary laborer. And when he finally told me what had driven him away that night, something deep inside me went completely still. People tend to assume that wealth makes life easier. In my experience, it only layered on more complications. I was raised inside a powerful dynasty. My father had built one of the country's most dominant real estate empires from the ground up, and by the time I reached 30, I had already taken the reins of a significant portion of it. Business publications splashed my name across their covers and called me a billionaire. But none of that recognition ever meant as much to me as the people I loved. Julian, my husband, existed in a completely different universe from the one I'd grown up in. He had no wealth, no influential family, no connections. The first time my father laid eyes on him, he took one look at Julian's modest clothing and pulled me aside afterward to whisper that someone like him had no place in our world. Julian, however, never once seemed bothered by any of that. He was steady, patient, and deeply kind, the sort of man who would rather fix a leaking pipe himself than pick up the phone and call a repairman. He noticed small things about people that others overlooked. He had a gift for pulling our daughter out of the darkest moods with nothing more than a silly joke or a warm hug. That was exactly why I loved him. We had been married for 7 years. Our daughter Lily had just celebrated her 5th birthday. From the outside, our life must have looked effortless and complete. But inside my father's grand mansion, an undercurrent of tension never fully disappeared. He never confronted Julian openly. He was far too calculating for that, but the disapproval was always there in his eyes. Every family dinner felt like sitting through a quiet war. One evening, after Julian had excused himself to put Lily to bed, my father leaned toward me with a particular coldness in his voice. He told me I still had time to correct what he called a mistake. I stared at him and asked what mistake he meant. He said my marriage. He told me I should be with someone who could reinforce the family empire, someone like his closest friend's son, whom he had in mind. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. I reminded him that I was already married and that he couldn't change that. He sat back in his chair and said simply that love doesn't build empires. I didn't respond that night, but those words stayed with me long after. Life went on. Julian and I did our best to push the friction aside and focus on what mattered: our daughter, our home, the small quiet moments we shared. Everything felt manageable until the night it all fell apart. It was raining when I came home late after a long day of investor meetings. The house greeted me with an unusual stillness. Lily always came running the second she heard the front door open, but that night there was nothing. No little footsteps. No laughter. Just silence. I called Julian's name. No answer came. I stepped into the living room and stopped. A white envelope sat on the table with my name written across the front. My hands went cold as I tore it open. Inside were divorce papers, already signed by Julian. My heart hammered. I told myself it had to be some kind of mistake and began searching every room of the house. His clothes were gone. His phone was switched off. Even Lily's small travel bag had disappeared. My daughter was gone too. For a moment, I couldn't pull in a full breath. I called him over and over. Nothing. I reached out to every friend of his I could think of. Not a single person knew anything. The entire night dissolved into panic. By morning, my father appeared at the house. I don't even remember contacting him, perhaps one of the household staff had. He walked into the living room, glanced at the papers on the table, and let out a slow sigh. So he finally did it, he said. I looked up at him in disbelief and asked what he meant. He told me calmly that Julian had left, that men like him always eventually did. My hands were trembling when I told him Julian had taken Lily. My father brushed it off, saying Julian would bring her back at some point. Then he picked up the divorce papers and told me to sign them. I stared at him. He repeated himself and told me not to waste my time waiting for a beggar. Fury rose in my chest. I told him Julian was my husband. He corrected me in a flat voice, saying Julian had been my husband, and told me to move on. I shoved the documents away. No. His expression hardened, and he told me I was embarrassing myself. I held my ground. He said Julian had already left me. I told him I would find him. My father let out a quiet, condescending laugh and asked whether I, a billionaire, truly intended to chase a man who had clearly run away from me. But something in me simply refused to accept that Julian had done this without a reason. Not without a single word. Not without so much as a goodbye. I folded the papers and left them on the table. I told my father again I wasn't signing. He studied me for a long moment, shook his head, and said I would come to regret it. Perhaps he thought I'd crumble within a few days. But he had misjudged me. I loved my husband, and I had no intention of giving up the search. Days stretched into weeks. Weeks folded into months. 6 months passed without a single message, without a call, without any trace of him, until the morning I drove out to one of our construction sites and my entire world lurched to a halt. It was meant to be an ordinary site visit. One of our flagship projects was nearing completion on the outskirts of the city, a large apartment complex that had absorbed millions in company investment. I had meetings arranged with the project managers. The morning felt routine. Vehicles moved in and out of the site. Workers carried tools through clouds of dust. The rhythmic thunder of heavy machinery filled the air. I stepped out of my car in a business suit and white safety helmet, and the site manager fell into step beside me, proudly reporting that they were running ahead of schedule. I nodded, but my attention was only half there. Even after 6 months, some part of me never stopped looking for Julian, scanning crowds, glancing at faces on the street, searching without even meaning to. We walked further into the site, passing steel beams and half-finished concrete walls. And then my feet stopped moving entirely. Across the yard, a man was hoisting a heavy bag of cement onto his shoulder. His clothes were stained with dust and grime. His hair had grown longer. His face was weathered and dirty. But I knew that face. I would have known it anywhere, at any distance, after any amount of time. It was Julian. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were telling it. The man who had once sat beside me at elegant business dinners was standing in worn work clothes in the dirt, doing manual labor. My breathing went ragged. The site manager said something behind me, but I was already moving, cutting across the site with purpose, my heels pressing into the loose ground with every step. Closer. Closer. My heart grew louder with every stride. Julian shifted to readjust the bag on his shoulder, and our eyes locked. The instant he recognized me, he went completely still. Shock swept across his face. The cement bag slipped and crashed to the ground. Workers nearby stared, but I was only aware of him. 6 months of questions. 6 months of grief. 6 months of silence. And there he stood, right in front of me. The rage that had been sitting inside my chest for half a year erupted before I could stop it. My hand moved on its own. The sharp sound of the slap rang out across the site. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't try to move away. He just looked at me. His eyes were exhausted. Empty. Why? My voice came out trembling. Why did you do this? Everyone around us had stopped working. We had an audience, and I didn't care in the slightest. You vanished, I said, my voice rising. You took our daughter. You left divorce papers like I was nothing to you." He said nothing. The silence only fed the fire. I told him I had spent 6 months looking for him. 6 months, Julian. He finally spoke, quietly asking me to lower my voice. I told him not to tell me what to do. I asked him how he could disappear from our lives and then simply reappear like this. He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You shouldn't have found me," he said. Those words hit me harder than I expected. What is that supposed to mean? He drew a slow breath, then looked around at the watching workers. He asked to speak somewhere else. I told him we'd speak right here. He studied my face for a long moment, and I think he realized I wasn't leaving without an answer. He finally spoke. "Your father came to see me the night before I left." My anger faltered for a split second. "My father?" Julian nodded. He hadn't come alone. A cold unease crept into me. Julian's voice dropped lower. "He told me my father had brought 2 men with him." My stomach dropped. And he had delivered a very simple message. If Julian didn't vanish from my life, he would make certain Lily never lived to see another birthday. I thought I had misheard him. My mind refused to process the words. Julian held my gaze and didn't waver. He said my father had called him a stain on the family name, an embarrassment to the empire. And he had told Julian that he wanted me to marry his best friend's son, the same man my father had mentioned to me months earlier. Piece by piece, everything began clicking into place. Julian continued. My father had told him to sign the divorce papers and disappear quietly. My throat tightened. I whispered, "And if he didn't?" Julian looked directly into my eyes. "Then Lily would disappear." The world around me went quiet. The roar of machinery, the voices of workers, all of it faded. Only Julian's words remained. He told me my father had warned him not to tell me. He said if I ever discovered the truth, his people would be informed immediately. I asked weakly whether Julian had simply left without fighting back. He nodded. He told me he'd had no choice. His voice broke slightly as he said he had believed that disappearing was the only way to keep both of us safe. I stared at him. The man standing before me bore little resemblance to the confident, steady husband I remembered. He looked as though life had been grinding him down for every one of those 6 months. He told me he had been working on sites for 4 months now, moving from place to place so my father's people wouldn't track him down. My hands fell slowly to my sides. My father. The man I had trusted without question my entire life. The man who had told me Julian had left for another woman. The man who had stood in my living room and urged me to sign those papers. Julian watched my face carefully and said softly that I clearly hadn't known. I shook my head. No, I barely had any voice left. I hadn't known. And in that moment, the full weight of the truth crashed into me so hard I nearly couldn't stay upright. I stood there staring at Julian, dust on his clothes, his hands roughened by months of hard labor, his face carrying more age and weariness than I had ever seen in it. 6 months. He had lived like this for 6 months. Not by choice. Not because he had stopped loving me. Because my father had left him no other option. My chest ached. I told him in a whisper that I had believed he had stopped loving me. Julian shook his head immediately. He told me he had never stopped. He said he had left because it was the only way he could think of to keep Lily and me from being harmed. My eyes filled with tears. I asked quickly where Lily was. His expression eased just slightly. She was safe, he said. He had left her with his sister. My father's people had no knowledge of that connection. The relief that flooded through me was so overwhelming my legs nearly buckled. My daughter was safe. But something else was building inside me now, something much fiercer than grief. Fury. Not at Julian. At my father. All those months, he had watched me fall apart. He had watched me search. He had watched me cry myself hollow. And he had stood there repeating the same comfortable lie, Julian left you. He wanted money. He chose to go. While knowing exactly what he had done. My hands curled slowly into fists. Julian studied me and asked what I was thinking. I wiped the tears from my face. I told him I was thinking that my father had spent too long believing he had the right to run my life. Julian cautioned me not to do anything reckless. I looked at him and said that for 6 months I had believed he had abandoned me. Now I knew the truth. Julian said nothing. I told him I was not going to allow my father to dismantle our family. That same evening I started making phone calls. The following week, my father hosted one of his signature gatherings at the mansion, a large affair filled with relatives and business associates, the kind of event he organized whenever he wanted to remind everyone how powerful he was. The house was crowded that night. Uncles, cousins, his most trusted business partners. And seated right beside my father, in what could only have been an intentional display, was the man he had always wanted me to marry, his best friend's son. My father stood near the center of the room, working the crowd with his usual polished confidence, utterly certain that everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. When I walked in, heads turned. He greeted me with a satisfied smile and said I was finally there. He looked me over and remarked that I seemed better, that I had apparently come to accept reality. I didn't respond. I simply walked toward him. The room gradually fell quiet. My father raised his glass slightly, telling the assembled guests that his daughter was about to make a decision that would secure the family's future. I looked around at every watching face. Good. I said quietly that I had something to say as well. His smile dimmed. He asked what it was. I took a breath. I told the room that for 6 months, my father had fed me a story about why my husband left. That he had gone chasing money. People shifted uneasily. My father's expression tightened, and he said my name in a warning tone. I kept going. I told them he had called Julian a beggar. That he had pressured me relentlessly to sign the divorce papers. My father stepped forward and told me that was enough. But I hadn't finished. I asked the room whether they knew what had actually happened. Silence fell completely over the mansion. Then I turned and looked directly at my father. I told him, and everyone present, that he had threatened Julian. A wave of murmuring broke through the crowd. I said he had told Julian that if he didn't disappear, he would have Lily killed. My father's face went white. He said quickly that it was a lie, but his voice had lost all of its usual authority. I stepped closer. I told them that the man he had dismissed as worthless had spent 6 months working construction sites and moving constantly, all to protect his family from my father. The room was utterly silent. His friends stared. His closest companion slowly set down his glass. I told him he had destroyed my marriage, that he had made me believe my husband had betrayed me. My father clenched his jaw and said through tightened lips that everything he had done was for my benefit. I shook my head. No, I said. He had done it for his business. The words settled into the silence like stones dropped in still water. Then I reached up, removed the diamond ring my father had given me years ago, the one that had always represented the family empire, and set it on the table beside me. He could keep his empire. Gasps rippled through the room. My father stared at me as though he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing. He told me I was being emotional. I shook my head again. Then I said the words he had never once prepared himself to hear. I choose my family, and my family is not in this house. I turned and walked toward the door. My father's voice rose behind me. He told me that if I walked out now, I shouldn't expect to come back. I paused for just one breath. Then I kept walking. Outside the mansion gates, a car sat waiting. Julian stood beside it, dressed in clean clothes, but carrying the same worn-out exhaustion in his eyes. When he saw me coming toward him, uncertainty flickered across his face. I stopped in front of him and asked if he was ready to go home. He looked surprised and asked what home I meant. I smiled quietly and told him it was wherever we went together. For a moment he was still. Then he nodded. We got into the car and drove away, away from the mansion, away from the empire, away from the man who had convinced himself that power was the highest thing worth having. But the truth had always been simple. The man my father had called a beggar was the only man who had ever truly loved us.